Welcome to the Psychedelic Couch. Before we dive into today's discussion, we remind our listeners that using illicit drugs carries significant risks and legal consequences. Psychedelic substances like LSD, psilocybin mushrooms, MDMA, and DMT are illegal in many countries, including the UK, and their possession or use can lead to legal penalties. Psychedelics can have profound effects on mental and physical health. While some report positive experiences, others may face negative effects like anxiety and psychosis. These substances can also interact unpredictably with medications and underlying conditions. Approach psychedelics with caution and responsibility. This podcast shares information, not encouragement or advocacy for illegal use. If you or someone you know struggles with substance abuse, seek help from healthcare professionals or local support services. In this episode, I sit down with Joe and Kyle, co-founders of Psychedelics Today, to explore the evolving landscape of psychedelic therapy. They dive deep into the importance of safety, education and training for facilitators in both underground and legal contexts, particularly with substances like MDMA, psilocybin and ketamine. The episode highlights the complex and multifaceted nature of psychedelic therapy, stressing that facilitators need to be well prepared, not only in techniques but in self-awareness, trauma-informed care, and understanding the broader cultural implications of psychedelics. I hope you enjoy. Hi, Carl and Joe. Welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for your time today. And I thought we would have a really important conversation. When your team reached out to me, it felt like really awesome timing, actually, to have this conversation around safety and around training and within the kind of underground and overground field. So whether or not government or the FDA approve psychedelics, it will still exist, right, in the underground and overground, and the need for really competent training to ensure that those working in the community have literacy in psychedelics. So maybe you could introduce yourselves and just tell the listeners a little bit about you and the work you do and Psychedelics Today.
Yeah, so I'm Kyle Buller. I guess I'll start this off, and one of the co-founders here at Psychedelics Today and Vital, which is our training program. My quick little background story is I got really interested in consciousness at a young age, so I was kind of interested in dreams and stuff like that. And then I had a near-death experience when I was 16. Got really bad. Yeah, that ruptured my spleen, and that really kind of changed my life. So coming back from that, I was kind of scratching my head going, what the hell's going on here? And fell into a pretty heavy existential crisis and depression, and ended up finding my way to psychedelics just through a friend, and had a pretty transformative experience where I was able to relive that near-death experience in a pretty unique way. And I just was left kind of like so curious, like how could people ingest things that grow from the earth? For me, that could replicate death like that all over again. So I just became intellectually curious. Did an undergrad in transpersonal psychology, met two really great teachers and mentors, Lenny and Elizabeth Gibson. That's how Joe and I know each other. Those are our breathwork teachers and community. They have an organization called Dream Shadow. And then did my master's in clinical mental health counseling with an emphasis in somatic psychology. Had a little bit of a small practice under supervision, doing ketamine therapy and just regular psychotherapy, and put all that on pause since things have got really busy here at Psychedelics Today and Vital. So I'll pass it over to Joe.
Yeah, so I first ran into information about psychedelic psychotherapy as early as 2001 as part of my undergrad, and it supported me in shifting my study from applied computer science to philosophy. I decided this is far too interesting for me to necessarily just spend my days isolated coding. You know, I think I wanted something a little different. And philosophy was really engaging, interesting. At the same time as I was reading this LSD psychotherapy work, I thankfully was able to access a few other of Stan Grof's works at the library my school had. And shortly after started circling around the same organization Kyle was talking about, Dream Shadow with Lenny and Elizabeth Gibson, and doing breath work a lot. And I think it was quarterly for years, which to me is pretty robust. think I did seven, I don't know the number exactly, somewhere around 7 years of breath work before even jumping into the psychedelic arena, which I think, I wish everybody could have that, but I know nobody's going to have that because who has that kind of patience or diligence?
And Joe, was that holotropic breathwork?
Yes. Yeah. Very graph oriented. So at the same time as we're having these experiences together, we're also discussing the work of Stan. We're discussing all sorts of things around psychology and psychiatry and spirituality for years and years, which was great primer for sure.
And then you guys came together and set up Psychedelics Today.
Yeah, the goal there was to document our teacher's work. He's a great speaker, great lecturer, and also to promote the work of Stan Groff because it wasn't really all that clear that transpersonal psychology was going to be included in the long run in psychedelics, just based on what we were reading. Everything was very, normal science, which is fine. We need that, but nobody was, as far as we saw, was really representing transpersonal in a real meaningful way.
And maybe could you just, for those who aren't aware, just set the scene of what the current landscape of psychedelics looks like, at the moment in the States with the MAPS FDA decision, just to give us an idea of where we're at.
FDA and Lycos are soon to kind of come to their first conclusion. August 11, I believe, the FDA is deciding if MDMA can proceed to be prescribable in America, which is very interesting and tense for a lot of us, right? A lot of us are really strong believers, think the data has been there for many decades, not just in the last handful of years. We're really hopeful that this could really, transition things to the next level and help many people in so many ways. I also think other drugs will come through the pipelines. I think yesterday, Kyle, what did I guess? Like at least 10 drugs in 10 years and that'll be psychedelic and prescribable. And I think that's a pretty conservative timeline. But yeah, we're soon to see psilocybin prescribable. There's a new form of ketamine, Spravato, that's actually a blockbuster drug for Johnson and Johnson. And there's all sorts of new variants on these more classical psychedelics that are coming around. So it's really interesting. Colorado is fully legal, right? Well, effectively fully legal. You just can't buy mushrooms, but you can gift and grow things like that. And that's really interesting. Always check with a lawyer, folks. I'm not your lawyer. And yeah, I think there's just a lot of progress happening in America right now. And it's really great to see.
Oregon is like fully legal in the sense that people can go to a service center. And then we have some local towns and cities that have passed decriminalization ordinances and resolutions. So that just means, it's lowest priority for police. Doesn't mean that you won't get in trouble, but, theoretically it should be low priority and people shouldn't be getting ticketed or arrested for possession of plants and certain medicines.
So, considering all of this, how do we need to think about training of facilitators, in the context of the landscape?
We've always kind of taken this harm reduction approach where we know people are doing it, right? And so many people are taking this into their own hands. And when we first started really kind of offering education back in 2017, that was really kind of like our ethos. It's like, people are doing this and where are they getting information? And so, we really want to, have people more educated, more literate, more competent around making better informed decisions around all this because the chances of somebody doing this in a clinic right now, I think is pretty low. Maybe you get the folks that are doing ketamine therapy or you're going on a retreat and doing that. But, I think a large majority of folks are doing this with their friends, with like a community group, stuff like that. And so I think we need to have more people, yeah, as I like to say, literate and competent around this to make better informed decisions. So they're, staying, safe with the law, staying psychologically safe, knowing kind of those potential risks that are involved. And I think about it as just as a cultural safety net in a sense, right? It's like the more people that are educated, I think then we can rely on peer systems. Okay, hey, like maybe, don't do X, Y, and Z, right? If I have a friend and I'm not that educated on it, maybe I don't know how to like, point them in a direction. But maybe if I do have a little bit more education around it, it's like, well, do you know the facilitator? Do you know how to ask questions around it? Do you know what you're looking for, right? A lot of people, especially in these areas where things are getting decriminalized and people are creating consumer packaged goods, and it looks safe, and we're finding that a lot of these mushroom chocolate bars actually don't contain any psilocybin in it. It might contain another compound. It might contain, I know 4-ACO is pretty big, which seems like a pro drug to psilocybin and psilocin. Is it risky? I doubt it. But again, I think it's more along the lines of informed consent, knowing what you're taking. And, people are getting marketed that, wrong things. And, when we think about harm reduction, what's your dose? How do you really understand how much you want to take? And I think that's where people get in trouble. They might look at something, so, oh, maybe I should eat the whole bar. And then all of a sudden they're having a really difficult time and might not have the proper supports around. Maybe they're doing it in a place like, hey, I'm just going to eat this chocolate bar and walk around the city instead of, maybe eating a chocolate bar in a safe container where, you're out of harm's way in a sense. So I gave you kind of, I guess, more of a general education than more of the facilitator. But I think, it is important to also get the general public up to speed as well, and not just always think about the facilitator training.
Yeah. And I was, thinking about the facilitator because I was thinking about what are the critical elements that need to be considered, and are those different in the above ground, underground kind of setting? How do they apply differently in those spaces?
Yeah, the facilitator trainings are interesting. So here's a fundamental frame that I always slip back to around facilitator training. And it brings me back to Stan Grof and holotropic breathwork. In holotropic breathwork, traditionally, it's got a number of names now for a number of reasons. But the training is at least 2 years long, and there's no drugs in the mix. At least 2 years long to be a holotropic breathwork facilitator. And we're seeing programs that are like, yeah, 4 weeks, you're a facilitator, go at it. And on one hand, I'm excited by that. On the other hand, I'm a little nervous or like quite nervous to see things like that. And, the controversy around online MDMA sessions, like really excited about that, also horrified. And I don't know if you saw the book recently, MDMA Solo. They had some really interesting framing around solo MDMA work, which is compelling for me as somebody who's been around the block, but I don't know who I would actually recommend that book to. So there's a need for a deep level of broad training and specific training. So Vital, we've structured in such a way that it's effectively, some people come out saying it was like a liberal arts degree in psychedelics. And I think that is really useful to give people this like broad spectrum understanding of where people have gone in the past and where they might choose to go with it. And that could be just their own personal use. It could be how they want to operate a clinic or an underground operation of some kind. And then specific trainings on like how do we do something that, looks like IFS or EMDR under the influence, or how do we just hold space, or how do we actually do intensive body work in session, which is very controversial, but in the Grof frame, very important. And, as if the psyche is totally distinct from body, right? As somebody with your background, you might understand that better than most. So like, there's so much to dig into in specific that we need a broad, I just stand by that. We need a broad education, and then we need more specific niche topics to be developed for us as we go. That's kind of what we did with Vital. But to the broader topic of training, most of us are pretty strong believers in this stuff. It seems to work really well, psychedelics for all sorts of transformation, including healing. And the less negative stories we see in the newspaper, the less people go to the hospital or have interactions with police that are suboptimal, the better for all of us in terms of progressing the movement, progressing safety, and much more. So how do we give people those skills and tools so that we're all going to be doing better, and we can all work collectively to deflate the drug war, and psychedelics being part of that.
And I'll follow up to your question too, just about like the underground and above ground. I think we need to kind of tease out these different settings that people are doing this stuff in and the different kind of scopes of practice, right? So if we're talking about above ground, and we're speculating here because MDMA isn't FDA approved yet, that's going to be a pretty specific protocol training in a sense, right? Does seem like their therapy is open, but the ethos and philosophy is really kind of based on the psychedelic research from the past, and the work of Stan Groff and others, and really focused on this inner-directed approach, and really having the person stick with their experience. And so, MAPS is trying to create that protocol around what the therapy looks like. They're probably going to get some interesting feedback from this whole FDA thing. Do they need to do, tweak things? The FDA doesn't regulate therapy, but I don't know, it'll be interesting to see how all that unfolds. And then, we could look at what does training look like in Oregon, where it's this quote unquote adult use model. So this is something that isn't psychotherapy oriented, whereas we say MDMA-assisted psychotherapy, there's a therapy component, whereas in Oregon, you're really just a facilitator and a sitter to some degree, right? And so what are those non-directive approaches that we can teach people that aren't intervening in the way that you're going to all of a sudden start doing, psychedelic assisted therapy with folks? And so that's going to look a little bit different than a psychedelic assisted therapy model. We're going to see kind of something similar here roll out in Colorado, where they're going to have a non-clinical track and a clinical track, where the clinical track, I believe, will be able to advertise being able to do psychedelic therapy for folks with mental health disorders. Whereas the non-clinical track, those folks, they all will go through the same training. And right when we start to have state regulated training programs, there's a certain curriculum that everybody needs to follow. And what I've heard is that the non-clinical track and the clinical track will be the same, but then it will be the scope of practice afterwards. So how are you then advertising and showing up? So the non-clinical person probably can't be advertising that this service is going to be able to treat your anxiety or depression, right? That might be more in the realm of self-discovery. And then so we have to look at what are those interventions looking like, right? Are we creating this self-discovery type of container, but are we starting to do psychotherapy, right? Are we starting to, really include some of those interventions and techniques? Are we starting to go into trauma treatment and go into, getting to that biography of somebody's life experience and narrative? And then we also have the shamanic container, where people are getting different types of training, energetic boundaries, doing all sorts of different energetic interventions. And what does that look like, and what are the ethics like? And then you have group work. And so, is it going to be different in group versus individual work? I think we really come back to this non-directive, inner-directed approach. And I just heard from some folks that have been through Vital, and they just went to a retreat, and they came back and said, wow, I'm just really thankful that we learned everything that we did in Vital, because this, was I guess it wasn't up to standards of maybe what they experienced through our program and at some of the retreats that they've been to, where we take this more non-directive, non-intervention approach, really focusing on this, what Stan would call that inner healing intelligence, and helping people to have their own sense of agency. You know what you need, right? And you might be interfacing with the medicine and having that relationship. And then how can you communicate that? So if you do need some intervention, how could you say, hey, I need this, right? Instead of, training facilitators with the idea that they know what's going on with somebody, and that they feel very convicted that something's going on. So I'm going to do XYZ shamanic intervention that I may or may not have a lot of training in. But maybe I did a weekend course in this, and I'm going to do that. That's where harm starts to happen, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And thinking about like the core competencies, then, what would you say are the core competencies to be able to sit in that space? And how do those differ maybe from traditional therapeutic roles? When you're starting to touch on it there in terms of intervention, but maybe it would be really useful for listeners to understand the difference.
Yeah, I think there is a lot of overlap between, what we might receive in therapy training or counseling training, whatever program you went through, versus, yeah, what a sitter might do. So I think some of those, we've looked at Dr. Janice Phelps's core competencies around, a psychedelic competent therapist. I forget the title of that paper, but and I can't remember it off the top of my head. But I think some of the core components are, you know, being an empathetic listener, so just being able to really sit and listen to somebody. And then something else that I really think about is, how do we sit with ourselves, right? So what type of inner work are we doing, and how do we regulate our own nervous system? Because I think that's where a lot of stuff comes up, right? An example I'll give here. Me and Joe, we were hosting this breathwork workshop in Arizona, and there was somebody that was just singing the F word. And my nervous system is starting to get a little activated. I'm going, oh man, like, should I, tell this person to stop singing? I'm worried about the group, and I'm thinking about group safety. So I think that's also a component. How do we create a safe container, also a non-judgmental container? And I'm, sitting there going, yeah, I might have to intervene and tell this person to stop singing this word, because it could be really disruptive to the group safety, the group container. And then I had to sit with it, and I go, wait, why do I want this person to really stop? Oh, I notice I'm anxious. I'm noticing people might, consider me as a bad facilitator for not for not stopping this person, right? So I went over and I checked in with Joe. I said, what do we think here, right? And I forget what you said, like, what are you feeling, or what's coming up for you? And I had to examine that and go, okay, I think I want to have this person stop because I'm feeling uncomfortable. And really kind of being able to have that self-awareness and do some of that self-reflection of, like, how is this triggering your nervous system right now? Oh, okay. I'm realizing that this is something a little bit deeper. So we didn't intervene. We let the person go. And, there were some other folks in the room that said, wow, like, what you're doing allowed me to go into my experience. Right. And then so, like, my perception of, oh man, everybody's gonna, like, be mad at us for not stopping this person, where it actually helped people to go a little bit deeper, because sometimes when we hear other people express, it gives us permission. And that's, I think, more common in breath work. I know in medicine sessions, people become a little bit more sensitive to that type of stuff, and we have to have a little bit, I think, more of a balance there. But yeah, so I think, yeah, that empathetic listening, just being able to create a safe, non-judgmental space, really sitting with ourselves and our own nervous systems, having good self-awareness. And I think the unlearning is that non-directive approach. And, I think sometimes in training as a therapist, we are very directive at times. And I remember, and I think I've just been trained in this more non-directive thing for so long. I used to get feedback from all my supervisors. They're like, you need to be more directive and stuff. And I'm like, but, how do we allow somebody to have their own experience without, this agenda coming in saying, I know what this person needs, right? Sometimes in that therapy setting, that does come up, and sometimes people just don't have the hindsight. But when we're working with non-ordinary states, how do we really trust people are having an inner experience where that critical mind, maybe that voice is dampening and going offline, where they're able to have a certain experience? And yeah, maybe we'll call that inner healer, an experience with psyche, and really to trust that, and trust that something is going on, which can be really hard, especially, I think, for some of us that are traditionally trained.
Yeah, and how, so much I was thinking about when you were talking then, and I've experienced that as a sitter. You can, when you were describing the person using that language, how that almost round the room, the energy can shift and move, and having one person act really highly activated triggers the next, and it allows them to go deeper. And then there's a piece about how should programs ensure that facilitators or sitters are able to handle or prepared for those kind of potential experiences that arise, the sort of psychological and the physical crises that can happen during sessions?
I think it starts with ourselves, and I think programs should really kind of emphasize some sort of inner work through their program, right? And I think I've become a little biased at times, like really focusing on the somatic aspect, because I still get triggered, facilitating and being a sitter in places. And, I have to sit there and sit with myself. And, that's really hard for a lot of people. And it's like, oh, but I want to learn some sort of technique or intervention or this or that. But I think it really comes back to how do we sit with ourselves? Because, we're a mirror. Right. And so if we're, considering mirror neurons, if I'm feeling anxious and I'm, showing that anxiety, and we'll just use somebody in like a medicine session and they're, communicating, they're going to feel that, right? So if I have doubts, if I'm feeling anxious and I'm really portraying that, that's going to be a mirror, and then they're not going to maybe start to feel safe. I always think of something that Stan Grof says where the therapist is the grounding rod for the client to test their reality. And so as their boundaries are dissolving, their reality is being tested. And the sitter, the therapist, needs to kind of help to create that boundary where they're like, okay, like I can feel safe with that. But if we're starting to feel doubtful, if our boundaries are starting to dissolve, they're going to feel that too, and that's going to probably amplify that anxiety. So I think it really starts with that inner work and being able to sit with ourselves and have that self-reflective process. Why am I feeling this way? Being curious, being able to go into it. I remember I was just at a breathwork cannabis thing, and there was a playlist that I put on that triggered some sort of like BPM2, this like no escape, as Stan Grof would call the basic perinatal birth matrices. And all of a sudden I had this thought, I'm like, I don't like this. I want this to end. Right. And it's like, as somebody who's DJing and playing the music, I'm like, this is really interesting. I'm having this experience. Like, why is this coming up? So I wrote it down in, the journal I had next to me. I said, I can't process this right now. This needs to, go away. And I had to do some breathing. I'm like, okay, I'm going to do some breath work. I'm going to do a little bit of movement and shake that out of my system, because, I can't be processing some of my own stuff that's coming up while I'm holding space for other people. And so, I think even as we become, seasoned in this, we're still going to get triggered. Our nervous systems are constantly reacting to things. We're human, right? We're always kind of picking up around the environment, right? Like, am I like in threat at all? Like, do I need to, our nervous systems are just that primal instinct. And, I think the more that we can start to become aware of it, the better, that we will be at holding that space for folks.
Mm. Yeah, so really important that programs balance scientific knowledge with the experiential work, and that you are continuing that ongoing work.
A really great analogy I heard recently was, imagine spending 12 years studying French, and then you try to go to the bakery in Paris and can't figure out how to order, right? Like, it's not necessarily true that that could happen, but I think the point is made that, like, with all of this expert knowledge, it doesn't necessarily mean that we can deploy it. And having that direct experience can help us quite a bit.
Yeah, and that it's an ongoing process, right? That our work is never done. It's a constant journey.
Yeah. And I think the analogy I used, maybe with you, Joe, at some point, but it's just, you just don't go flying into space, right? Like, it takes years of training to do that. And so, how do we train our physical bodies and our mind to be able to like hold these types of experiences? And I think in like our culture, since this is so novel and exciting, people just want to jump in really quick. And maybe it's not quote unquote as sexy as like, to take your time, really learn some of those foundational skills, learn about your nervous system, learn about your own kind of like, inner world. Sometimes we just want to like dive in and dive into the deep end. But, I think it is important to come back and come back to those basics. And I think, Joe, when I mentioned this, you might have said something about like, those ancient yogic traditions where it was like, we really needed to train our bodies because this is the vessel in which the experience comes through. And if we're not, properly training that, how can we hold those exceptional experiences when they do come? Sometimes that will blow somebody's nervous system out, right? It's like too much too fast.
Yeah, which is why we're definitely incrementalists in terms of a lot of people will just say, go for the big dose, the really, really big dose right away. I'm like, maybe not, especially if you don't feel ready. But, if somebody had been doing yoga daily for 20 years, I might think differently,
Yeah, so the importance of sort of low and slow, just gradually building up. And are you finding that people are taking that approach, or in reality?
It's all of it. It's definitely both ways. Like on Reddit, you'll see these discussions around ego death competitions, which is hilarious to think about generally. But yeah, like the conversation around the 5 gram heroic dose is very common now and a little troubling. Sure, some people can do that. I don't think all people should do that. And likewise, microdosing super popular because you kind of don't feel it necessarily.
So real emphasis again on education of the public, education of sitters, facilitators, therapists to really be able to hold the space for those experiences that people are having.
Yeah. And I think like this is kind of like a general statement that I've heard throughout the past 3 cohorts of Vital, where people come in with like these high expectations that they want to be a facilitator or a guide, and really kind of gung-ho, so wanting to jump into that deep end, and then kind of exploring all the nuance to the program. People at that halfway mark or towards the end, they go, oh, whoa, like I actually realize I don't know that much. And this, these could be folks that already have an underground practice, and they're like, whoa, I guess I never got training in some of this stuff. Or, they might come to like a workshop or a retreat and they go, wow, like that was really difficult. I don't know if I actually want to sit there for 6 hours for somebody. Like I'm actually maybe more interested on the integration side of things. Like I want to support people pre and after. So it has been a really interesting experience hearing some of this, of people actually slowing down and questioning, like, how do I want to show up in this field? Once you start to talk about all the nuances, the ethics, the boundaries, what could happen, those potential risks, and then having that your own personal experience with the medicine or space holding and going, whoa, this is a lot. Like maybe I had this perception that I was going to do this full time. And then all of a sudden, you sit in a session, you go, I don't know if I could do that. Maybe once or twice a month, but I don't know if I could do that every day, every week as a career. So that's just been like an interesting kind of thing I've been hearing throughout the program, where it does feel like, as we've been really focused on that inner work and kind of self-development in a sense, people are kind of doing a little bit of that self-reflective work too, and going, how do I want to show up here? Maybe I don't want to be a facilitator, or maybe I do, but I'm starting to realize now I can't do this right. I need more education. I need more training. I need more experience to feel confident to do some of this stuff. So, I had this conversation recently with some folks about this. I feel like in our culture, we've kind of developed education in the sense of checking off boxes. Here's the curriculum. This is the stuff that you need to check off. And now all of a sudden you're competent, versus more, say, like what Joe and I went through with breathwork. It was more of this like mentorship program, because they didn't necessarily have a whole training program put together. So it was like more of this thing of just showing up and doing our work, and just having the opportunity to shadow and just be mentored in that way. And I feel like that's like kind of like a lost thing in our culture. We want to do things quick. We want to do things fast. We want to check the boxes and get that certificate or whatever it is. But to really take time, like Joe was saying, like, that training is a minimum of at least 2 years. And it consists of like a lot of inner work, versus, if we see these state models. And I also get why the state models, like Oregon, was only 120 hours. Like this law came in effect, they needed to get things out. And then these questions around like, what is the bare minimum to get this up and running? Because, now this law is in effect. But, this work is a lot, and I think it takes time, and we need to kind of respect that. But I think that's also a challenge for our Western culture, because we've kind of lost that art of mentorship.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's, talking about ethics, kind of thinking about like what role professional organizations and peer networks kind of play in maintaining the standards, right, in both above and underground, and that need for mentorship and supervision, ongoing supervision. I mean, the training that I'm currently on, it's 2 years with IPT, and what has been astounding is the power of the group. Never in a therapy training, and it isn't a therapy training, it's a depth relational process that we are all going through. The fact that we're all psych professionals, that we're not bringing our clients, we are there bringing ourselves, and the power of the group is it's blown me away, actually.
Yeah, Maria and who was the other person? Ted
Tim.
or Tim?
Tim.
Tim. Yeah, I
Yeah,
knew it was Ted.
exactly. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
I mean, when they first launched, it's like this looks awesome.
Yeah.
I wanted to
It is.
sign up.
Yeah, yeah. It is incredible. So yeah, like thinking about that, how can we create spaces where that support is there?
The community support and the group support.
Yeah, and that the mentorship and the ongoing supervision or
We came up with a line recently, like we don't want students, we want peers. And I think this was modeled to us at Dream Shadow as we were coming up, where it was, you're bringing your information, everybody else is bringing their lived experience and stuff they learned recently and their experiences. And it was a collective kind of sharing thing, very egalitarian. And as you've probably seen in therapy, sometimes like having a hierarchy, like I'm below you because I'm the sick person and you're the person that's going to help me. Like that's a really complicated dynamic sometimes. And if it's all egalitarian, that becomes a little less complicated and can be distributed to the group, and the group can help resolve a lot of that kind of stuff over time. And again, in a non-directive way, it's just by being held and supported, seen, witnessed, etc., that a lot of healing can happen. And then we throw in the heightened states through breath work or substance and have some really interesting healing.
I think that's an interesting thing about that model where, if you go to a public workshop and, when we've hosted this within Vital, it's like, oh, we're doing this because it's a training, but it's actually, this is how most public workshops are operated with the breather sitter pair. And it's a really beautiful thing that, when you go to most retreats, it's like I'm going to just work on my own healing and say, we'll just use like psychedelics where everybody's down, right? And then you have like the group facilitator kind of doing intervention and doing all this stuff, but everybody's under the influence at the same time. Versus like this other model is people are showing up and being able to sit for each other, right? So in the breathwork model, it's that breather sitter pair. So it's not just like, okay, I'm showing up and just going to have like a breathwork session with everybody. It's like, oh no, I'm showing up for myself and I'm showing up for somebody else. And we've had folks like in the past just also say how healing that was, right? To not just focus on yourself. And I think, there is something within our individualistic culture that it begins with us. It does begin with us, but like, how do we extend that out, right? And not just be so focused on ourselves. And I think that's how that community system really, it's like, wow, I got to sit with you through like your really difficult experience. And that was just so beautiful. And sometimes that sitting experience is more powerful than the journey, some people say, right? It was like, that was so hard to just sit there and watch you cry for hours. I wanted to intervene. I wanted to give you a hug. I wanted to do this, but, it also felt really empowering to let you have your experience. So that's what I also kind of love about that model. I think it does bring us onto a similar page. And then, you have the facilitators that are just trying to hold the space for everybody, right? But I just love kind of like that, how that peer connection starts to form, I think, a little bit deeper when you do have that opportunity to sit with somebody else and you're not just thinking about yourself the entire weekend or week.
and as you say, how healing that can be. And people can be so surprised by the power of sitting, and that, as you say, that can be as healing as breathing themselves.
Yeah, it's a really beautiful thing. Sometimes hard, but I think it is a really beautiful thing to get out of our own heads and be able to provide that support to others, right? It's like, I know there's this cliche saying like healing happens in relationship. And I think that type of model helps to bring that to the forefront a little bit more. And that was just something like organic Stan ended up developing because he hurt his back. Like at first when they started to do all that, everybody was down breathing at the same time, and then hurt his back and didn't think that he could do body work. So they had everybody sit, and they just, what they started hearing was people were having these really profound experiences just sitting with folks, and they didn't change the model since. And I think it's a really beautiful way. And I think it's a really awesome way for training to learn how to sit with ourselves, right? Again, We're getting triggered by all that's happening in the room, and how to hold that and just be grounded. And then, sometimes it can be really boring. People are like, oh, like, nothing was going on in the room. I had to sit there. Great. That's good. How do you sit with yourself for 3 hours and, just be there?
And I've always felt that, it's a brilliant model for life, because actually when we're in relationship with our partner, our friends, our family, it's not about fixing, and actually just being with is the essence of a lot of what you're looking at in couples therapy as well. So really learning to maintain or contain one's own affect, to just be with, to be alongside, is such a powerful lesson for life.
Yeah, and like, when are those times in our lives when people are just there with you? Right? Somebody came back from the street and they're like, how can I just be a pillow for people in my life? Right? I think they watched us working with these pillows and just supporting somebody through that, versus needing to fix something and needing to like and it's just like, how do we just provide that support? Right? Because we're always like bombarded with like unsolicited advice and stuff like that, when we're just maybe just trying to share something. We just need to get something off our chest, and then boom, somebody has an answer for you. You're like, I just needed to share something. I don't need all this feedback. Maybe I just need somebody to just be there.
I love that. I think I'm going to borrow that. Definitely. Yeah. What are your thoughts, Joe?
So this group relational process concept, I think, is essential. I think generally process relational thinking is underrepresented in the way we think about psychedelics and healing. And one thing we've had added to our kind of orientation is philosophy. Like, how many people are studying philosophy as they develop through their, psychedelic career, if we want to call it that. I think it's been really helpful for us to have some sort of grounding in things like, the ancient Greek world, for instance, where people were wrestling with very interesting concepts in very interesting ways, and how that's still relevant today, even though it was, 2,500 years ago or something like that. It's pretty compelling. And that there were contemporary philosophers that are still really helpful here too. Our friend is a philosophy professor at the University of Exeter, and he is really deep into Spinoza, Nietzsche, Whitehead, and a few others. And it's helpful, at times inspiring, at times grounding, at times expansive. Philosophy as a psychedelic is kind of an interesting concept for me. I think I got a lot of really great mind expansion through studying philosophy in my undergrad. And yeah, I think doing that in group in an egalitarian way, where it's not like you're just getting lectured at exclusively, you're able to participate, bring things to the table. That's like validating of your intellect too. It's not just this whole thing is not just validating of your psyche and body and your process. It's like, oh, look, I have a mind that's actually worth something too, as opposed to like, the only people I can trust are the ones that get on Science Friday or something, some sort of establishment channel. It's like, oh, just because you don't have credentials, your mind is still pretty amazing and helpful and should be here.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think I'm probably super off the rails. Could you bring me back on the rails?
Yeah, well, I'm kind of thinking about like how then as a community we can kind of ensure safety, or I don't know, bring that education piece, and thinking about all the different levels, right? Of from sort of psychedelic assisted therapy to someone who's sitting for a friend. It's kind of across the board, right?
Yeah. I like to expand the scope often of psychedelics when I talk. Like Stan Groff at one point, I think talking to Lenny Kyle, was saying he was just not really all that excited about the research happening because effectively it's all been done before. Sure, there's questions we don't have answers to, but largely we understand that this stuff could make very excellent medicine, all of the classical psychedelics. And there's other frontiers that we're not digging into. I remember Tom Roberts, who's I think one of the first people to have a university listed course on psychedelics in America. He wrote a book called Mind Apps, where he was talking about in psychology, we actually and psychedelic research as an extension, we need to be looking at, what is the effect of LSD under this scenario, under these sets of circumstances, under those. Like, what does it look like to study the psychology of karate with LSD, for instance? I think there's some really interesting questions there. Like we're seeing a lot of professional athletes microdosing and macrodosing, sometimes in competition. We don't know what that looks like. That's really interesting. And in some of the data suggests that it should be a shit show and people shouldn't be performing well, but they are. And not always, but often. And then if we start looking at things like what Jim Fadiman talked about, what was this gentleman's name? Willis Harman and Jim Fadiman and others at around Stanford, I forget the name of the place, Institute for Advanced Study maybe. They were doing psychedelics for creative problem solving and solving really meaningful problems in a matter of hours that couldn't be solved in months. And I like to extend that into, okay, the climate situation. Like, we have a really desperate situation on the planet right now. The leaders of Extinction Rebellion are going to jail, which is potentially a net positive for that movement, though dark anyway. But we need technology to help fight these issues. Like, we need things that are better than oil for the biosphere. We need, energy storage technology, so we don't need to be producing the most extreme amount of electricity all the time for peak, just so we can hit peak need or meet peak need. What if we could reduce that by a quarter by all of us having localized energy storage in our homes with like really much cheaper batteries, not using rare earth elements, hopefully minerals. What if we put people on, deep solar and wind engineers in these psychedelic creativity sessions, and they're making things 10x cheaper or 10x better through a few psychedelic sessions, and as a result, reducing our need for oil and helping with the biosphere generally. So I think there's a lot of major problems that could be tackled by using psychedelics, not just us, like not just solving the problem of me and my soul or psyche, or relationship problems, but, major technical advancements that could allow us to live on the planet for at least a couple hundred more years. So expanding the scope beyond psychotherapy is my point.
And what do you think, what are the biggest challenges that you face, with trainings? And
there's not yet any national or international accreditation body. The APA organization in the States was really close to doing that. I've heard there's progress from some other organizations. I think we do need standards across training programs, but that needs to be rigorously debated. I remember being on some of the early calls where we were trying to work towards national accreditation as a group, and the myriad perspectives that need to be represented in some sort of baseline training is just staggering. And I think we can do it, but I think in order to respect all of the traditions that all seem to work pretty okay, in my opinion, it's going to be a lot of work, and that's something that needs a lot of funding and help. And that'll inform how we all structure our training programs in the future. And Vital will be part of those conversations for sure. I don't know, Kyle, what other problems are you seeing around training?
The accreditation thing is big, right? I think that's like the number one question that we get. And now that, we are starting to see some standards with like Oregon and Colorado coming online and being able to create these state standards. But then, we get into conversations around like portability and reciprocity. If more states come online, if I take this program in Colorado, can I transfer that to another state? And that's stuff like we just don't know yet. And I think, I don't know, maybe that will be exciting in the sense that that will happen because it's such a new field and maybe we can kind of get ahead of it. Like, I just think about like, the counseling field, for example, they're now coming around and doing this compact where you can possibly transfer your license. And here in the States, it's like so different state by state. And so it's like, to transfer a license, you might need to take another class. You might need to do your hours again. You might need to do certain things to meet those requirements. And it's nice to see. And I think, the pandemic really kind of like amplified that in the sense of like, what are boundaries, once like remote work started happening a little bit more, like, I had a client that was in, college and they were in state, but now they had to go back home, and, now I can't like continue my service with them because they're in another state and da da da. So it's like, I think that has accelerated to some degree. And, I think we will continue to see those like state regulated standards, but that is an issue because people want some sort of accreditation along with this. But I'd like to remind people that this is just the beginning, like if to get involved in psychedelics right now, you need to be a little comfortable with a little bit of chaos and uncertainty because anything can happen. Laws can go back. And I like to just point to what happened in Oregon, where they pushed back Measure 110, which was more of a full drug decrim bill, but psychedelics were wrapped up in there. And so, we had forward progress in drug decriminalization, but then they backtracked on it a few years later. And now, psilocybin theoretically in personal possession is now criminalized again, where it was decriminalized. So anything can happen, right? And we need to be comfortable with that. And I think to Joe's point where he was talking about all these different use applications that, I think a lot of programs are just so specifically therapy oriented or have a therapeutic context because a lot of this is talked in the regard of healing. And if we look at, say indigenous cultures, a lot of it was done in healing. If we look at now what's going on in psychotherapy, it's all healing. But yeah, there's these other contexts in which people take psychedelics for. And I think Stan's line was, yeah, it's all this is great, but I think the real potential here is in creativity. And so, what does it look like to also create kind of a holistic program that honors and accepts like a variety of like, uses. And it's not just so, like I say, like therapeutically oriented. One of my fears sometimes is, psychedelics get trauma boxed. Anything that you experience, well, we can fit that into a trauma box. It's like, oh, well, that image, like, how does that relate to your mother's, experience, stuff like that, versus like really accepting the uniqueness of some of these experiences and how, people can interpret them themselves instead of just always kind of going back to that lingo. And I obviously appreciate the therapeutic paradigm, and I do like to work in that, but I think we also need to look outside of it as well. And what does that look like? What does training look like if we're able to create a place for creativity, right? Does that look a little bit different than, say, a clinical setting? And I think some of those aspects will be the same, like that non-directive, interdirective approach, creating a safe set and setting for somebody, non-judgmental, and we don't always know. And I think we do need that competency around like maybe interventions and trauma in case stuff like that comes up. I mean, we could do the best assessments as possible, right? Like we can really know somebody's, history, but sometimes we don't always know what's going to come up in sessions. So I think it is important to be trauma informed and to have like maybe, if you, well, yeah, we're speculating here, but okay, we have this Center for Creativity, and to have somebody that's trauma informed that could help in case something like that comes up. And then I think the other aspect of training and a challenge is, since this is a new field, like, I think a lot of people feel like psychedelics are here, but it's like, what is the pipeline? People aren't going and doing, those services above ground, unless you're in a place like Oregon or soon to be Colorado. But I've also heard, some people have dropped out of the above ground, and they're just kind of continuing to operate in the underground because it's a little bit easier and cheaper. And so that's another thing, is accessibility, right? So, we're talking about a lot of this stuff, but and then the reality is if it is going to be more in these like centers, it's going to be pretty expensive to start off, because the time and resources that it actually takes for people to go through these experiences, paying people 6-8 hours to sit there with somebody, it's a lot of money. And then if you think about like, if you're doing the 2-sitter to one journey or pair, right now you're paying 2 people for that. So, I think that's something we're going to also need to figure out as well. And then, yeah, I guess I'll go back to the other challenges. I've already mentioned it, but just checking the boxes versus, you know, if we look at, say, indigenous cultures, you didn't just become a shaman within a year. It took years and years of study. And, it's like, how do we also help people understand the power of these substances, and really kind of respect it? Because I think for the Western culture, we are venturing into like uncharted territories at times. I'm reminded, I was having a conversation with somebody that studied with a shamanic tradition, I forget where, and they said, they don't do ayahuasca all the time, as in say like the West is, right? We're maybe doing a lot of this. And I said, well, why was that? And they said, well, it was more of a community effort, right? So like the community had to be on board for the thing that the person needed. So we'll use healing, for example. Somebody needed healing, and then there was a community consensus. And I said, well, why was it so community oriented? And they said, well, when we go into these realms, we start to open up kind of portals, and that energy can then leak back into the community. And is the community in consensus with that? And we're obviously talking more from an animistic shamanic worldview where everything's alive. There's energies that can pour in, and stuff like that. And this is that transpersonal phenomenon that like we just don't talk about, right? We kind of ignore it and say, okay, this is kind of spiritual, and we shouldn't acknowledge it. But psychedelics are pretty interesting. And I don't know, I've definitely had lots of experiences where I felt like that was true. Like, I'd have an experience and felt like something opened up, and then all of a sudden it's starting to, unfold in life. And, it has me scratching my head going like, what the hell is going on here? Like, when do I go into these spaces? Do I think about this, like these transpersonal phenomenons? Does it have ripple effects in our life? And I think it's so novel to us where we go, oh yeah, well, we can just like do ceremony after ceremony after ceremony and do some of this stuff. So, obviously that's like, kind of a personal belief at times, and also maybe a little wrapped up in some shamanic worldviews. But, it is, thinking and considering, what is the transpersonal ripple effect when psychedelics start to become so mainstream, and stuff like that. So I don't know. Yeah, there's a lot there.
Yeah. I'm just thinking as our time's sort of coming to an end, like what advice would you give folks that are starting out on this journey? And that could be, therapists, mental health practitioners, or members of the general public just wanting to equip themselves, to educate themselves, and to explore the world of expanded states.
I think read broadly, go to psychedelic conferences when you can, meet plenty of other people definitely from different areas and orientations. I would advise, if at all possible, becoming model and substance agnostic. I think that's really helpful and important. It's not necessarily the case that you need the thing that's most rare, or most powerful. Go slowly and be in community and get as much education and experience as you can at the right pace.
Great. Thank you, Joe.
Yeah, I was just going to say patience and curiosity. This can be a long journey. I mean, I've been studying this stuff since, I don't know, 2007-ish, 2008. And, even going through the journey of creating Vital, offering it, being, working within it, doing study groups, hearing the lectures, like I've learned so much in the past 3 years or 2.5 years, however long it is. And it's like, sometimes I'm like, oh, okay, like I know this stuff. And then I hear something different. So how do we continue to be curious and open and continue with that learning? And the patient piece comes back to that, I think, respect, right? Like these are very powerful states of consciousness. How do we really honor that and take our time with it and not rush the process, right? And I think there is a feeling of wanting to rush it because the ship has sailed, and wanting to get involved quickly and being able to like offer this work. But, also take your time and really kind of, do your own inner work, sit with yourself and really consider like, do I feel ready? Right. I think when I first started offering breathwork experiences more to the public, I think I was I was training for at least like 4 years. And I started small. I started with a group of friends that invited some friends, and then slowly started to kind of like build that up to where I felt comfortable. And so, take your time. It's okay to, take your time and be slow with this. And if possible, find people that have been here before. That can be a mentor, whether it's a peer mentor or somebody that, it's more of a professional mentor. Like, I'm just always so thankful around, the mentors that like me and Joe have had throughout the years, like people just to like call and bounce ideas off of, or just like call and need support and be like, yo, this thing just came up and I have no idea like what I'm doing, or like, did I completely fuck up here? Right? Like, how do I navigate this? And so really start to create your peer and professional network. And as Joe mentioned, like go to conferences, go to events, and start to really develop that network, because we can't do this work alone. And I know a lot of people are, right? A lot of people are working in the underground. They can't really talk about their work. It might feel risky to come out and say what they're doing. I know a lot of therapists also feel that way too, just working in private practice, maybe not being part of a group. And I know a lot of folks do seek out that supervision and group mentorship and peer supervision. But yeah, really find a network of people to work with, because yeah, this is tough work and we can't do it alone. So yeah, just be patient, go slow, really kind of continue to be curious and ask more questions. And I think, yeah, it's a really important thing.
And what did I miss, guys? What should I have asked? What question have I not asked that you wish I'd asked?
So the primary thing I didn't really get to mention is around the drug war, understanding the history of the drug war, how that informs our attitudes towards substance today, and how that actually harms people in really serious, meaningful ways, and how that's contributed to the overdose and overdose death epidemic in America, and how that feeds our paranoia and perhaps our set and setting going into psychedelic experiences, and that we all collectively need to work towards ending the drug war so we can all be safer and we don't have to see our friends die anymore, friends and family die anymore from it. So, yeah, kind of end rant.
Do you have any training on that? Are you offering any training in that space?
We've been published in a book by Bloomsbury called Psychedelic Philosophy. Is that right, Kyle?
Something like that. Philosophy of psychedelic philosophy. I don't remember.
It's behind me somewhere in this mess. But yeah, it was supposed to be about psychedelic ethics around the drug war, or ethics around the drug war. We had to study Aristotle, and then turns out we just wrote a history of the drug war instead, and got that published. And that's available. It's a core part of our curriculum in our courses. Like, we definitely talk about it quite a bit. I don't think we have anything specific, but that's a really good idea. I think I've wanted to do that for a long time. I just haven't pulled the trigger. But yeah, it's an important topic and dear to my heart.
Well, let me know when you do it. I'd love to listen. What about you, Carl?
The first thing, I'm just gonna go with the first thing that kind of popped in my head. And we're talking about psychedelics, and we've kind of touched on this a tiny bit, just maybe re-emphasizing that psychedelics are just one part of the experience. And I think we have to sometimes do a lot of unlearning around that. And I think this is like what breathwork has like really taught me over the past decade of doing this, is that it really starts with ourselves. And the breath or the psychedelic is just an amplification process of what's going on inside of us. And so how do we also do a lot of unlearning around like, this experience is going to create change in my life, right? It has the potential, right? But I think what happens when we get so caught up on the substance is that we start to put more agency on that. And that's where, I think some risks can come in, especially with people that are very vulnerable, and really, at their, it's their last ditch effort. I've read everything about this. And, now this is the thing that's going to like save my life. And, we have seen things in the past where that's somebody's experience and they put a lot of agency on the medicine. And so, I also like to challenge that and pull back and say, how do we really start to develop relationship with psyche and ourselves, and know that all of it's inside of us and it's also the community around us. I think a lot of that community support is really important. Like I always say, there got to a point where I stopped going to breath work just for the breath work experience. It started to become more about the people. And so, we're getting into, the important topic of integration. When do we actually maybe pull back from some of that and start to focus on our daily lives? Right? There's so much time that we can just get caught up chasing experience. But, how do we come back here, have better relationships, have a better quality of life, really focus on the things that are important in front of us? Again, and I think it's coming back from, okay, not having to constantly go in and do my own stuff, but how do I show up for the people around me? How do I show up for, the things around me in my life? I think that's how we start to create change in the world, is when we also stop thinking about ourselves. And I don't know, I get caught up thinking about myself and my own dramas all the time, but sometimes I pull away and go, there's other stuff that's going on that I should show up to. And I think that's the work, right? And as sometimes people like to say, the real work begins after the journey, after the ceremony. How do we really emphasize that? And so I feel like in the training world, that has been a really difficult thing, to have to maybe do a lot of this unlearning, where the focus is so specific to the medicine versus trying to switch that focus to the integration and the things around us, that's happening in our daily lives, and really kind of, shift that focus. So those are things I've been really kind of thinking about over the years as doing training, right? I do see a lot of people come in with just so much emphasis on the experience. And I think over the years, just seeing the importance of the community support, the integration, how that's going to lead to, I think, a more meaningful life than just chasing experience after experience.
And how can people find out about your trainings and courses?
Yeah, you can check. So if you're interested in Vital, that's our 12-month more in-depth program that we've been really discussing here. You can check that out at vitalpsychedelictraining.com. We do have our 4th cohort starting in September, I believe September 17th, and that will run until late August, early September. So if you're interested in joining that, that's vitalpsychedelictraining.com. We do have some smaller courses, kind of like little one-off topics like psychedelics in the shadow or ketamine and trauma treatment series. We have like our navigating psychedelics course, lessons on self-care and integration. And you can find all that at psychedeliceducationcenter.com. So if you just want some smaller courses, kind of get in there. We have some free courses. We have a free course called like 8 Common Mistakes. Another one, Spiritual Emergence or Psychosis, which is an important topic. I feel like we didn't touch on that enough as well. But so that's psychedeliceducationcenter.com. And then again, vitalpsychedelictraining.com.
Amazing. Thank you so much for your time this morning. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Claire.
Thanks for having us
as well.
Bye.
Bye.
You've been listening to the Psychedelic Couch. For more episodes, please follow me on Spotify, Apple Music, or wherever you get your podcasts, and find me on Instagram at the Psychedelic Couch and at Clare Faulkner Therapy, where I will be keeping you up to date on the latest episodes and information surrounding all things therapy, psychedelics, and expanded states.